You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 2, Episode 12, Liz. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Today, I feel tremendously honored to introduce you to Liz Laddie. Liz shares her story, we talk a lot about our dads, and we dive deep into adoptee activism. I usually do this at the end of the show, but I'm going to ask you a big favor up front today. As you're listening, if you feel moved, if you are hearing some of the things Liz is sharing and think, oh my gosh, I know exactly who needs to hear this today, please share this episode with them. I know it will bring encouragement to many of you to know you aren't alone on this journey. Liz and I wrap up the episode with some recommended resources, and as always, links to all the things we're talking about are on the website adopteeson.com. Stick around to the end because I'll be letting you know details about the season finale of Adoptees On. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to introduce to Adoptees On, Liz Laddie. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, Haley. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to tell you that I'm so excited. Oh my gosh. See, I'm sorry. I'm already starting to fangirl. I promise. I'm not going to do that. You've written some very, very powerful pieces. And I feel like you are really getting our voice out there. So thank you so much for your work for us.
Thank you.
I'd love it if you would start off by just sharing your story with us.
I was born in Michigan, in suburban Detroit, in the late 70s, and was adopted through Catholic Social Services at about two months old. I was in a foster home for about 2 months. Was raised about 10 miles from where I was born. I was raised with an adopted sibling, and we had no biological tie, and we had really different experiences of adoption, and I think and I was sort of always really deeply grieving from a really young age, and always knew that I would search for my family. And it was a closed adoption, and so didn't really have much information. I started searching when I was about 18. It was a really sort of very difficult, tumultuous time for me. I was raised by an extremely Catholic family, and I came out of the closet when I was 17, 18 years old. It was not a pretty scene. And so I was actually, fairly disconnected from my adoptive family, because of that, and was sort of really reeling from that kind of rejection around my sexuality. So of course it seemed like the best time to search for my original family.
Of course. So why wouldn't you want to just bring all the feelings in?
Yeah, of course. It's fine. It's great. So I started searching when I was 18, but I was also sort of living in a kind of very transient state. And it was also before a lot of technology was available too, we're talking about the late 90s. And so because I was at time, sort of in and out of homelessness and transience, I didn't really have access to computers or internet or money or anything. And so it took me quite a while to find my original family. And I actually ended up finding what folks like to call search angels, though at the time I hated that they were called search angels, because I was, on the heels of being rejected from a very religious family and community. The prevalence of religion in adoption was very difficult for me to deal with. I was really angry at that part of my life. So I sort of resisted working with a search angel for a while, simply because they were called search angels. And I was like, I don't want any angels. but I did end up working with someone who was able to find my family within about 3 weeks. It was pretty quick. And so, and then, met my original mother and her family, and then found my father sometime after that, though that was really difficult as well. Yeah, I found out, I got my father's contact information, but found out that he was born again evangelical before I contacted him. And so I was, I had already been rejected by a religious family for being queer. And so I was terrified at the possibility of that happening again. And so I didn't contact him for quite a while, almost a year after I had his information. But I finally did. And so I was in reunion with my mother for about 2.5 years. And then that sort of fell apart for reasons that I guess I'm still trying to figure out 15 years later. And, but I am still in relationship with my father to this day. And I also have 9 half siblings.
Whoa.
Through him. Yes. And I have relationships with them and with their mother, to varying degrees as well. So that's been a really, amazing part of my reunion. And my adoptive family and I have worked long and hard to sort of repair our relationships and build relationships together as adults, and sort of, figuring out how to accept one another. And so yeah, so that's my story.
Well, we often don't talk about reunion with our fathers. So would you mind going into that a little bit? You said you were kind of afraid to contact him and you waited about a year. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. Well, it was really just because of the religion thing. Mm-hmm. And it was like the religion of intersection and queerness, which is just really volatile often, right? As we know, right? I mean, not, I'm not saying across the board, right? Lots of religious folks are perfectly open and loving to various sexualities and gender presentations and all of these things. But, sort of historically speaking and certainly my personal experience had been really, really difficult. Mm-hmm. And so I was really scared, and I think too, though, that something about it being my dad, I think made it a little bit less urgent, I think, which is strange, but I think it makes sense, right? Like, when I found my mother, and the first conversation I ever had with her on the phone, she told me his name and she told me their breakup. They had stayed together for 2 years after I was born. They were very much in love. Teenagers, at the tail end of high school, and had stayed together, and then had gone through this really painful trauma of losing me, because it was not what they wanted. They were forced into it. And then had a really painful breakup. And so, she was like, here's his name. I don't ever want to talk about him again. And we didn't. We never did. It's like, all right, cool. And as soon as I had his name, I was like, huh, that's so weird. I kind of have not really ever thought about him. Like I had, but not really. It was sort of always about the mother. It was always about the mom for me. It opened a new window, it opened a new window that I hadn't thought about and that I was really interested in, but it just didn't have the same urgency as it did with my mom. And so I think that, both the fear of being rejected for my sexuality, like yet again, and because also I think that often, in religious communities, rejection of queerness is really violent. So it's a real, they thought I was mentally ill and were like joining, the groups that were trying to like pray people straight. And it was like the height of the ex-gay movement in the like mid to late 90s. And, they really thought they could cure me. They also thought it was like a symptom of like attachment disorder. And so sort of pathologized it around being adopted. That, was pretty emotionally violent. I was just like, I'm not doing that again. I'm not going through that again with another family. I had like his name and address and phone number on a little piece of paper, and I just folded it up and put it in a shoebox and put it under my bed for quite a long time. And then one day I just was like, if I don't do this, I'm going to regret it. And I just pulled it out and I called him. And he said that he always knew that I would find him, that if I had any of him in me, that he knew that I would find him, and that he was just waiting. And then we talked on the phone for like an hour, and it was really easy. And he's super chatty, and we have sort of, we're both really chatty and like crack lots of jokes, and he actually does comedy, and he's an actor and a musician, and it was just really easy, And again, I also sometimes I think, well, is that also because, it was never easy with my mom. It was never easy. It was always a struggle. But then, but it's been 15 years, and we have certainly, there's been difficult times, and we've lost touch for years at a time and then reconnected. And it's not been without its challenges, but sort of the initial reunion, we lived in the same place at the time. And so he just immediately wanted to come over, and he came over, and I made my girlfriend at the time, who we lived together, hide at the neighbors.
Oh my gosh.
I know, which I still feel like guilty about. We're friends to this day, so she's forgiven me for all the trauma, but and she understood at the time too, like she's a really loving person, and so she's very compassionate and empathetic, and so she understood, that I was just terrified, and that it was real, that I had been rejected already, and that fear was really real, and so she hid at the freaking neighbor's house. Well, my dad came to meet me for the first time. But then I went out to his house, which was about 25 minutes from where I was living in Detroit, and met his kids and his wife. And she immediately just sort of claimed me as one of her own, still does. They only had 7 kids actually at the time, but 2 more twins. My youngest brothers are twins. They came, just a little while later after that, and his wife actually asked me to be the other person in the delivery room. Oh. Wow. So I was there for their birth with my dad, and my dad was actually the last person to hold me in the hospital before they took me away. Mm. So when he was 16, 17. So that was a pretty powerful, pretty intense time. So yeah, it's been a 15 years of an ongoing roller coaster, and I'm constantly surprised at how new things come up all the time. Like I'm still finding things out that I didn't know before, or getting conflicting stories about things I thought I knew before. It's like and I'm still finding myself with new questions all the time. Yeah, I mean, my dad and I had actually lost track of each other. Well, we not lost track of each other. We knew where each other was, but we hadn't talked for about 7 years until last summer, and we saw each other last summer, and sort of started a correspondence again just this past year. And so it's a new level, it's just it's like always new. It's sort of, which I just think about and want and write about a lot, and this just, this idea, this experience of being on the other side of reunion long term, and what that means, what it means to build relationships with people who in the beginning sort of all you share is it's like this shared history of trauma, but otherwise you're sort of strangers, and what that means over time, and how that grows and ebbs and flows and stuff. So,
well, I found it interesting, Liz, when you said that your father said, I kind of knew you would find me and I was just waiting for you. Do you think he ever would have searched for you? This is something I've asked. I've asked my dad this probably 3 or 4 times. And I think his answer is no, but he can't say it to me.
I don't know. That's a great question. He might listen to this and maybe
my dad listens every week, so I'm kind of like, ooh, is this going to make the final cut? I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I don't know about formally. I know that informally he was sort of like constantly searching for me. Always. He told me, and in fact recently, like just this past year, he kind of went much more into detail about our story from his perspective than he had previously. And whew, it was really hard to hear, and I'm sure it was really hard for him to say. And so just how deeply he was affected by this, which I think is another thing that we just don't think about with like first fathers a lot too, right? That it can really, losing a child can really derail their lives too, even though they didn't physically, weren't the birthing parent.
When you were telling your story and you're talking about how we think of the mother first, and you're like, oh, I kind of didn't even think of, should I search for him? I think that's so common.
Yeah.
And I think because we have this picture of our mother and we're, inside of her for 9 months, and it's easy to picture that connection. And the father is, it's a one-time contact. Oh my goodness. Right. How do I say that?
Right. And I think that too, we're often, and I think I'm going to say the word political, but and I think it is, I think because of like the way that, the sort of political context of like the narrative of adoption, right? Like what we're told, what people think about birth families, right? That they're unfit in some way. I think often like the idea is that like the father isn't around, and that might be true in some cases, but there was never like a picture of him in the narrative that I was given, but he was very much there. He was very much there. And, but that picture wasn't given. It's not that it was like, it was given and my parents like hid that from me. And that's not like the narrative that they gave me. Like that wasn't given to my adoptive parents. You know what I mean? A lot of the narrative in my adoption file is just false. It's just absolutely false about what was going on. And I think that may have had something to do with the religious nature of the agency, like the stigma around, I don't know, but I mean, my father was like cataloged as the father, and like it sort of was like, these are his siblings, these are his parents, like everybody's supportive, everybody's on board. So it wasn't like he was absent, but there was no like, I don't know. I mean, they were like a long-term committed, very much in love couple, and he was very much there. And she was in fact sent away while she was pregnant, and he drove up like hours, like every weekend, and snuck into the maternity home to visit her. And they stayed together for years. They moved across the country together after he graduated. And so from high school, because she was a year ahead of him, so she was already out. And it really affected him. It affected them. It affected her. It affected their relationship. It affected everything. A child just doesn't go missing with like no consequences, right? For like, and so it's like he really talked about how painful that was, and about how much shame was involved. And in fact, he left the state and didn't come back for over 2 decades because he felt that he had shamed like everyone. And then when he finally came back, he just sort of imagined that I was in Michigan still, and that like anytime he would see a teenage girl or a young woman, I would have been like around 18 or so at the time, and he would just freak out every time, and have like a panic attack and start like following her, and then was like, oh my God, I'm going to get arrested for following young women. Like, what, it's there, that really affected his life, and he carried that wound too, and I think that hearing that part of his story, while it was really, it's hard, of course, like it's hard to hear that. It's hard to hear his pain, but it's also really validating, because like as someone who talks about adoption a lot, sort of obsessively and writes about it publicly, of course, like we always get this pushback, of the narrative that like it's the whatever the narrative we all know, right? And what I'm always sort of harping on is like there are consequences to this, and like families are not like interchangeable, and people then live with a lifetime of grief and trauma and to varying degrees, and it affects everybody, and it doesn't just affect the person who gave birth and the child. My mom's sisters were like, her father was the one that forced her to give me up. And they were furious at her father for years and like held it over his head. It was like, it reverberates, like it moves through like multiple generations and multiple family systems, like this wound. To hear him say that and talk about how it had affected him for so many years and still does was just sort of really validating in that way of like, yeah, I've been saying this, because I knew it was true. I knew it was true, and I've seen it in other people and in myself, and in the way that my reunion unraveled with my mom. Sometimes the pain is just too big that we aren't able to find a way to connect with each other across it, and that's really unfortunate, but it affects so many people. It affects so many people.
Well, I'm just in conversation with this beautiful woman who is a grandmother of loss. And when she tells me parts of her story, she is just heartbroken because she is the mother that convinced her daughter this is the right choice. And this is just a few years. The story is just a few years old, the child that's been lost to adoption. It does. It reverberates. That's such a good word to describe it. It affects all the generations and further down as well. Yeah. It's preaching to the choir, of course. This is what I get to. Liz, can we just go back to when you were first meeting your dad and stuff and you're hiding your girlfriend?
Yeah.
What?
I still feel guilty.
I mean, I don't know. At least she had a different house to go to. She wasn't like under the bed or something.
Yeah. Well, it was just the apartment next door. We were living in like really crappy student apartments in Detroit, but
she had like a glass up against the wall.
Yeah. No. Look, the closet is a very complicated place.
I said hide under the bed. That's what I.
Yeah.
No. Are you comfortable just talking about when you told him that you were queer, how that went? Because you were so scared of that part of your story.
Well, I can tell you it's interesting that you asked because I actually just told him in October.
Okay. Yeah. Did he know?
Yeah, he pretty much figured it out.
Okay.
But which I was very angry at because I'd gone to great lengths to stay strategically closeted from him. Apparently not good enough. I blame Facebook's privacy preferences and my inability to apparently set them properly. Yeah, I just told him. It was kind of crazy. I stayed closeted from him. Well, so yeah, it's been like 14 years. Because I was so afraid. And so, and then once my brothers and sisters were sort of in the picture for me, and with their mom as well too, right? I was afraid that, I knew it could go either way. Like, maybe they would be totally fine with it. But if they weren't, like, what if they didn't let me see my brother and sisters? That kind of felt like my main motivation sort of after the initial reunion. I was like, I don't want to get cut off from them. And then I came out to my older siblings, as they sort of moved out of the house and I had relationships with them, some of them are now in like their early 20s. And so like as they sort of moved out of the house and, would come visit me or I'd visit them or something, I wasn't going to hide my life, like, or, if they were going to come visit me and I had a partner, like I just wasn't going to do it. And they were super cool. Like the millennials, they don't care. Like they are also very religious and all of the things, but they're also very much of their generation and like have queer friends and like aren't necessarily, bound by what, a church or a clergy member or something really says. So they were really beautiful and accepting, and we're like, we literally don't care. We love you. We think you're cool. We don't care. So, but, I had asked my oldest brother, what do you think that your dad would say? And he was like, yeah, it could go either way. I really don't know. And that was quite a few years ago. And so I was like, all right, just gonna, like, we also didn't live in the same place by that point either. So I didn't see him often or whatever, and so it's just like, there's just like not really a reason to, but it also, I really struggled with it personally because, I'm also like, I'm very involved in queer community and I write about queer issues and I, consider myself an activist around queer issues. And I understand that the closet is a very complicated place for people for lots of reasons. And not everybody can be out depending on where they live, depending on what family they're in, like it's not necessarily safe. And so, but I still felt guilty, I was like, wow, like I'm this like totally out, like super queer person. And I'm closeted to like over half my family. And that felt really hard for me to live that way. And so my father and I, didn't talk for quite a few years. And then when we reconnected last summer, I was like, I got to tell him this time. Like I'm almost 40, first of all. I'm like too old to be like hiding girlfriends and like, just bringing decoys to family events or whatever, like it's just, come on. Like I just, I'm just like, I can't. And I also just decided this time that I said, you know what, look, we haven't talked to each other in quite a few years. If we're going to reconnect, like I want it to actually be authentic this time. And I don't want to have to hide part of my life. A lot of people, will often say like, well, why do you need to tell everybody? But it's like, most of my friends are queer and trans. Like I date other queer people who are like very physically queer. Like it's like you have to jump through a lot of hoops. It's not just about like broadcasting your sexuality, right? It's like I actually have to hide a good portion of my life. And so it felt really important to me to connect with him on a really open, honest, like authentic level this time. I was like, what's the worst that can happen? He cannot talk to me again. Well, we didn't just talk for the last like X amount of years and I survived. So I need to know, and I need to actually know now, because if we like reconnect and like start building a relationship again, and then it comes up in like a year or two and I'm like attached, and then it is a problem and it is a deal breaker, that will really suck. So it's like, I'd rather know now. I wrote him a very, very, very long email. And it was actually on National Coming Out Day in October, which is really weird because I'm not sort of like a anniversary, but like, I don't know. It wasn't like, it normally didn't feel like something I would do like on a specific day. But I just got sort of emotional seeing other people's coming out, like really sweet coming out stories posted on Facebook that day. And I was like, I'm going to do it. And so I stayed up till like 4 a.m. and I wrote him this very, very long email because I wanted him to know, like I wanted him to know how painful my coming out experience had been as a young person and how much that affected my life. I felt I was pretty homeless and familyless. And, for many years, I mean, I had my own family, like chosen family and other, queer folks. And and that, that like secondary rejection on top of being adopted, right? It was like, wow, okay, nobody wants it. And I wanted him to know that. And so, and I wanted him to know that it was also fueled pretty much solely by religion. And also, how painful it had been for me to feel like I had to make the choice to hide from him too. I told him everything. And I also told him that, if he thought I was mentally ill or gonna burn in hell or could be rehabilitated or whatever, that I wasn't interested in hearing it. He could just let me know that it wasn't cool with him. But like, I was like, I've heard every scripture. I've heard every like rationalization around, whatever. Like I've heard it all. I'm not interested. I came out when I was a teenager and I'm almost 40. I'm cool. Like I love who I am. Like, so, but I just need to know, what your deal is and need to know that I can be myself around you. And that I can bring people I love around you. I sent it to him and I was super terrified and like sweating and sick to my stomach, like couldn't sleep and like, couldn't concentrate at work the next day. And then around like 3 in the afternoon, I got an email back from him. When in the email I sent to him, I told him, well, it's National Coming Out Day, so I have a little something to tell you, and he sent an email back around 3 in the afternoon, and he had like edited the subject line or whatever, and it was all caps, and it said, "It's National Love Your Queer Daughter Day," with like 18 exclamation points. And then he said, he kind of said all the things that everyone should have said to me when I came out. He recognized how painful it was for me. And he said that he was really sorry that I had to carry that burden. That there was like no Bible, no scriptures coming, no prayer circles, that he is really proud to be my dad. And no matter what. And then he took it as an opportunity to tell me he was voting for Trump. So it was a little weird. But okay. So he's a comedian. He was like, so you're queer. So I'm voting for Trump. Who cares? So I don't know, but
I'm sorry. I'm like, I'm bawling over here and you can probably hear my Kleenex and now you're okay.
Yeah. So that's the kind of relationship we have at this point. So complicated, right? But also really beautiful. And it really felt like a gift,
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I'm just, getting myself together. I cry every episode. What's okay. I would love to touch on with you just a conversation about activism in adoption. And you've wrote some extremely powerful pieces and that have been, of course, well received by adoptees like myself who have been trying to say this, like, will you listen to us? When are you going to listen to us? That there's a trauma attached here. Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about your work in this space, things that have been effective? Like, what do people actually listen to? And what kind of responses you've gotten? Yeah. So, for example, to the fairy tale narrative piece.
Yeah. I mean, I think overwhelmingly the responses have been really positive, and folks have reached out to, really like thank me for helping them think about it in a different way. And I mean folks who are attached to it in some way, and also people who aren't, which is great. And then, whatever, you get some trolls that want to like tell you about how mentally ill you are and what a disaster you must be, whatever. But that has everything to do with where they're at and nothing to do with where I'm at. So in terms of activism, like it's a scary place to be, it's a really scary place to be, I think. I've been writing about adoption for a really long time, pretty much since I was 5. And and I'm a creative writer. I went to school for creative writing and have mostly sort of existed and written and published in like literary spaces, more often than not, until really recently. And I mean, where the Rumpus, where the What We Lost was published, is a literary space. It was certainly a personal essay, but it also had a lot of kind of political and historical content in it as well. And then the last one that I did for the establishment was much more like sort of straightforward and almost kind of
that one is adoption is a feminist issue, but not for the reasons you think. Also excellent. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I've sort of been like tiptoeing out a little bit more in terms of being kind of like overtly political around adoption. And I've always been an activist, and I was kind of like sort of nurtured and raised in like queer and feminist activist spaces, and then kind of brought those politics to bear on my experience of being an adopted person. And sort of understanding this experience and the institution of adoption through those lenses, it's compelled me to sort of talk about it more in a sort of more straightforward political way. And I've learned from so many adoptee activists around me that have come before me and that I consider friends and peers and colleagues now, and have been doing scholarship and activism around adoption for so long. But it's a really scary place to be, to sort of step out and talk about the political content of adoption and not just about your own story, because I think that it does sort of open up, you open yourself up to like more criticism, I think. And the argument becomes much more complicated and requires a lot more sort of like precision and accuracy and research and all of those things. And so, but I'm enjoying being in those spaces. And I think that one of the things that it helps me do, and one of the things that I sort of, the reason why I guess I like to talk about sort of adoption activism with other adoptees kind of more and more and as much as possible, is that, I feel really passionate about actually creating larger, systemic change in adoption, and rather outside of adoption, because I think that adoption is really just a symptom and a failed solution, right, to like larger systemic oppressions, and mostly shouldn't ever actually have to happen. But I think that sort of moving into the political content of it has really helped me in terms of understanding my own story better. And that's one of the things that I feel like I like to kind of offer to adopted people too, is that like, I went through, between therapy and being a writer, writing about my own story of adoption, I was sort of processing it through language and through personal narrative for a really long time. I could only get so far. And then when I started really doing more research and investigation and trying to understand how adoption, the history of adoption, and how it came to be the practice and institution it is now, and the way that it affects different groups of people differently, and just all of this, all of the political content of it, it really took me to the next level of understanding my own story and being able to actually tap into a much deeper well of understanding and compassion for everyone that was involved in my adoption. I could have stayed really angry at my first mother for our reunion unraveling for a really long time, but sort of getting more information about what she went through, and then sort of understanding her not as like one woman who made a choice or didn't make a choice in a vacuum, right? Because that's just like not how it happens. But situating her within like the historical and political context in which she did and did not have choices really helped to sort of, it helped me tap into compassion more, and it helped me kind of get to a next place in my own healing. And then, of course, I think, as always, right, what happens when like people make a sort of life around trying to create change within a system or a life experience that they have survived, right? Like, which often happens. Right. That's often how people come to a particular kind of activism or work, right? It's like you went through this thing and it really sort of, changed you, or, partially kind of defines who you are in some way or whatever. And then you figure out how to make that into work, or make that into a life's work of some kind, and engage with other people and connect with other people and work towards something that hopefully means that other people don't necessarily have to go through what you went through, right? I think too that then that also helps in healing, because I think it can, like, being adopted specifically can be such an isolating experience and such an isolating identity. And becoming involved in activism and in community helps to it puts some salt on that wound a bit, and it makes you feel, or it makes me feel, at least it makes me feel active and purposeful and just clear-eyed, and which is not to say I don't sometimes slip back into feeling victim-y, because I do. And I think that that's normal and just human and whatever. But I also have a much larger and broader context and understanding for what happened, that I'm able to pull myself out of that thinking pretty easily. If I do, have a bad day and slip into that or whatever. And I also have like folks that I can reach out to that have also had this experience, and can connect with them. And so I think that is really important. And I meet a lot of adoptees who are like, yeah, I can't go there. Like, I'm not interested in like the political arena of it. This is just my story. It's just about my family. And then there's tons and tons of us who are invested in, in activism, and everybody's got their own journey. Right. But I do think that, that it's important. And I think that there needs to be a lot of change, but I do wonder about how we're going to make those changes, and I think there is such a broad range of understanding, because there's such a broad range of experience in adoption and how people experience it, and then also how people come to it, that there's a lot of divide within the adoption community about like what activism looks like, or what changes need to be made, or what reform looks like, or what abolishing the system altogether looks like, or whatever, right? There's just like a range of activisms, and that's okay, but we're sort of small in numbers and we kind of need each other. And we don't, like, change happens through numbers often, right? Like it really requires movement building. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's so much that I often see a lot of divide within the adoption community, and that I guess I think about that a lot, and I wonder, sort of how we can better forge alliances with each other, and then also looking outward, like align ourselves with larger movements that might not know that we're part of, like what they're working for, like movements for like economic justice and reproductive justice and racial justice. Like all of these things are underlying, like all of these things are, sort of like the underlying oppressions that then, adoption is sort of this like whatever solution. It's not a solution, but like whatever for, right? And
well,
so
I think you said it before, like it's a symptom of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a symptom of these things, right? It's like, and so then And then, and so like, I just wonder how, how does adoption community, align itself with each other and then also move outward and align ourselves with larger movements, because we have to. I think we have to get bigger and stronger and louder. Yeah, I think about that a lot, but I don't really have any particular one answer about that yet, but I think that there needs to be a lot of growth in that area. So
I really appreciate your wisdom on that, Liz, and thank you for those comments. Something that I touched on with an adoptee, her name's Erica Curry-Vanney, and what she said to me that I never thought about before was that adoptees are an invisible minority group. And she was talking about it in the context of, receiving our original birth certificates and how this is a human right and et cetera, which of course most of us have heard that before. But that was so interesting for me to think about, because we have been maligned in some way, but yet it's also hard to speak about that, because you don't want to ever say less than to another group that has, felt like they've been marginalized. So I don't know, it's
Sure.
a sticky balance for me, but I really have been thinking about it a lot since you said it to me.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's true. I think it is largely, I think, because we're just like displaced and dispersed all over the place, right? We have this narrative, in this country that sort of erases our experience as a trauma, as a symptom of oppression, right? And so, it's just the redemption narrative that folks focus on. And so, because our pain, because our displacement, because our loss of culture and language and all of the things that adopted folks experience, it is largely erased underneath that narrative. I think it's true. Like, I think we are invisible to some degree. Though I totally agree with you in terms of, like, I think language is really important, right? Language is super powerful. And it makes me think about, like, I actually just on Facebook earlier, yesterday or something, I saw this posting about original birth certificates. I think it was for New York or something. I think there's a bill right now that's sort of passed and it's not clean or whatever. And so someone was posting about it, and the sort of slogan on the thing was like, said, "Adoptee is the last minority to be denied their civil rights." And I just thought to myself, my God, like, when are we going to stop saying things like this? Because it's, first of all, just so factually incorrect. And it's offensive and alienating to so many people and groups of people who are denied their civil rights in this country every day. And a lot of adopted people also belong to those groups. So it's like not only alienating to folks who are not adopted, it's an alienating to folks who are adopted and live at the intersection of, like, being an adopted trans person, being an adopted person of color, being like, right. It's like, come on, it's just, and it's like, we, that kind of language is like, it's really troubling to me. And I just, I don't know. I think that, and it sort of further kind of like, it deepens this gulf too, mm-hmm. right? Within the community as well. Right. Because mm-hmm. like, you're taught, like, lots of it's just,
it's so maddening. You can't even find the words.
It is. It's really, it's tough, and I see stuff like that a lot. Mm-hmm. And it's really difficult. And I think that we need to, as a community, think deeper and broader than that, and that the fight for original birth certificates is important. I still don't have access to mine. It's important. It's important work, but it is not the only work. And we can't do that work at the expense of folks who belong to our community as well. Mm-hmm. And other people who experience the loss of civil rights as well, right? It's like we're talking about like movement building or aligning ourselves with like other movements, right? We're a small community, right? There's what, 5 million of us in the country supposedly, which of course we will never really know because nobody keeps records about us because they don't care. But like we have to think about aligning ourselves. Our struggles are not necessarily different than folks who are fighting for dignity and civil rights in other ways, right? Yeah, and so I think that we have to really examine that as a community and do better. And do better for everyone and also for like our own work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, we could talk about this all day, but yeah, what a great conversation. I love those. I love what you said about that we need to align with other communities. And so we really need to watch our language because those things that we say can alienate. Yeah. So that's really important. Thank you. Okay. So let's move to recommended resources. Yeah. I'm bringing back something that I have recommended before, but it's so good. I have to recommend it again. So 6-word adoption memoirs. I don't know if you've heard of this, Liz.
I have, and I have met its makers.
You have met its makers. Recently, yes. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they have been working on this for quite a while, and they've just released a 6-word adoption memoir video for 2017. And it's so moving. It's a 20-minute video, and it features adoptees as well as first parents. There's even a father and son, and the father was adopted from an orphanage, and the son speaks to how his father's experiences affected him. Anyway, it's very moving, and talking about adoptee activism and things and how powerful our stories are. When something like this spreads, I think it brings awareness to some of the pain that adoption has caused. So it's so beautifully done. Andrew Tash and Derek Frank are the ones behind the project, and I will put a link to that video. It's up on Vimeo, and they have, of course, a Facebook page. And this was kind of exciting. I read one of their posts, and let me just read it out here. We shot 40 plus stories, and only a handful are contained in this video. We'll be working on more stories throughout the year. So if you follow that Facebook page, you will be the first to know about when they've got new ones coming out. So I really recommend that everyone go in and follow that. And you've met them. I actually was in the same room with Andrew, but we never spoke. And he emailed me later, and I said, "Oh my goodness, too bad we didn't connect."
Next time around, next adoption conference around.
That's right.
Yeah, we met down in Atlanta at the AAC conference. So.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, it's great to meet them.
Yeah, I emailed back and forth a little bit with Andrew. Just really nice guy, and I can't wait to see what else they have up their sleeves. So
absolutely.
Okay, here's the moment of truth, Liz. What are you going to recommend to us today?
Oh gosh,
no pressure.
I know. There's just so many that come to mind, and I think. Specifically, I guess maybe, I'm thinking just around our conversation around activism, a few books come to mind. I think it's just really important and for us to know our history, right? And not just our history, our family history, but our larger history, right? As people who have been affected by the system and institution of adoption. And so One really good online resource could be the Adoption Museum Project. Are you familiar with the Adoption Museum Project?
I get their newsletter. It's actually on my list of things to recommend. So you beat me to it. Go ahead. Tell us about it.
They're a project based out in the Bay Area. You can find them at adoptionmuseumproject.org. They do different kinds of work around adoption through a social justice lens, and there's not a physical museum space at this time, but they do different kinds of like pop-up events and installations and field trips and think tanks and all different kinds of stuff around adoption, both the history and sort of the future, and again through a social justice lens. So they have a great newsletter. Laura Callan is the founder, and she sends out a fantastic newsletter with lots of great resources in and of itself every month.
Absolutely, they're so generous with their spotlight, right? They're always highlighting different people's work there. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So that's a good one. And then just, if you want to geek out, like I like to geek out, Kinship by Design is a great book for learning more about the history of modern American adoption. It's by Alan Herman. And I guess thinking too more about like how systems of like economic and racial injustice really sort of are the, kind of underpinnings of adoption and sort of what that means for like our future. I think in terms of, activism, I think some other good resources would be one book that comes to mind is Beggars and Choosers by Ricky Solinger. I would also encourage folks to learn about the reproductive justice movement as well. And a good place to learn about reproductive justice would be the Sister Song website. They're a women of color collective based in Atlanta.
Great. Thank you so much. Those all sound fantastic. Liz, thank you for sharing your story with us. It was so moving, and I know it's going to help many people to hear your journey.
Thanks, Haley. It was really great talking to you. Thank you for having me.
You can find Liz's work on her website, liz-laddie.com, and also through openrecordconsulting.com. Liz is on Twitter and Facebook at Liz Laddie. I can't even believe this is episode 12. And in my seasons, I have 13 episodes. So, math, that means in 2 weeks, I'll be airing my season finale. And I don't want to build this up too much, but it's worth the wait, I promise. Jasenia Palmer of I Am Adopted shares her story, and I kept her up super, super late because we just couldn't stop talking. You don't want to miss this episode. So make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm also going to be launching a monthly newsletter to keep you in the loop. It's only going to be monthly because no one has time for more email. I definitely don't. You can subscribe to that on adopteeson.com. Last but not least, this episode was brought to you by my fantastic Patreon supporters. I can't even believe this. I have 28 generous partners who have pledged to support me monthly so I can continue to produce this podcast for you. They literally make it possible for me to keep these adoptee stories coming. Thank you, friends. Thank you for standing with me. If you want to stand with us to make sure adoptee voices are heard, you can visit adopteeson.com/partner. Thank you for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.